I'm pleased to say, actually, we have 4 keynotes this year, and they are from New York, San Francisco, Beijing, and Singapore. And so I think you'll hear a diverse perspective throughout the day. I'm very honored to say that Roger Sharp, who is based in Singapore, will be our opening keynote speaker. Roger has 30 years experience in global 30 years global experience, in financing, running, and advising high-tech growth companies. He started his career in San Francisco, which is where I spent 25 years, in 1982, and he founded DataCorp, a database company which he later sold. Roger was an investment banker with the company that later became JP Morgan. And then after that, spent 5 years as CEO of Asia Pacific Securities in Hong Kong and global head of technology in London. In 2002, Roger founded a technology merchant bank, Northridge Partners, which is an active technology investor and advisor here in the HK region today. Roger has chaired or been a director of many companies and is currently chairman of Asia Pacific Digital Limited. Roger's talk this morning is titled The Digital Tsunami and What It Means for Business. Thank you. Roger, please come to the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Roger Sharp. Hey, buddy. Thanks for being here.
Now, a little bit of housekeeping.
Okay.
Slide mover. Let's see.
That should do it.
Ah, it works.
Okay.
Josan. Lehama. Oh ho. Good morning. I should start by thanking Cyberport and Hal for the opportunity to be here today. It's a great privilege. I used to live in Hong Kong, and I've just given you about 40% of my Cantonese vocabulary. It's always great to come back here. I'm going to take you on a little journey today through digital disruption and innovation. We had a very interesting discussion over dinner last night, and Dave Moskowitz, there you are. It was very interesting. I'm on a tour of boards, CEOs, management teams around the region talking about digital disruption. When you look at this subject from the perspective of a big company, it's very threatening and very challenging. It's very hard to know what to do. Dave said something very interesting last night, which is, I'm going to paraphrase you, I've never felt more optimistic or positive about the future than I do today. And that's really the dichotomy that we face, because if you run an established large company, it's pretty scary. If you're an innovator, if you're here at this magnificent place, Cyberport, you're a challenger. You're taking on the establishment. So in my book, you're either disrupting or you're being disrupted. The little journey I'm going to take you on today takes us through what happened in the dot-com boom. It'll be very brief. Through what we call Tsunami 1.0, which is the period from 2000 to 2010, the first decade of the new millennium, and then 2010 onwards, which is where the action really starts. So let's just perhaps begin by talking a little bit about what some of the experts say. It's very noisy out there. There are a lot of people talking about disruption. And there are quite negative connotations about the theme of disruption. There are many Harvard professors and other academics who are really good at this stuff, who have pretty strong views. Names like Clayton Christensen, Michael Porter. It was very interesting. One of their colleagues at Harvard a couple of weeks ago wrote an article in the New Yorker magazine saying a whole industry has been spawned talking about disruption. And people are using big words, big emotive terms like mega this and exponential that. So hence the reason if you're in an existing company, you're trying to work out how to deal with this, it's quite emotive. Of course, if I look at my original startup experience, in 1983, I did my first startup. Bootstrapped it, had no money. I think when we got back from San Francisco, I had an IBM PC and about $800 in the bank. And I decided to set up a database company. Was fortunate to find a venture capital firm that would back us. All the money we raised went into buying some pretty hopeless hardware that ran out of bandwidth within about 3 months. Half the rest of the capital went on writing a program, some code in COBOL. Raise your hands if you've heard of COBOL. Okay, some veterans here. And we ran out of money really quickly before the application was even built. But today, it's just all changed. You don't buy your hardware. You've got processing capability that's infinite by comparison with what we had then. You can crowdsource, you can get your development work done over the web, you can find people in here or in Manila or in China, so everything's changed. So it's, whether it's 100 times the innovation of prior periods or 50, it doesn't really matter. The environment's changed. I wish I had done my startup today. We got out of it alive, it was okay. So, the commentators. There are some really interesting books being written on the subject, and before digital disruption was anything we'd even heard of, the famous futurist Alvin Toffler wrote a book called The Third Wave, and the third wave essentially told us that the agricultural revolution took thousands of years, the industrial revolution took hundreds of years, and the IT revolution would just be very, very quick. Those words were very prescient, and they were written in 1980. So it's happening very quickly. There's another book that came out recently called I Disrupted, and one of the many takeouts from this book is that of the top 100 companies in existence today, 80% will not be in the top 100 companies in 30 years. It's a pretty amazing statistic. Of the top 100 companies, 80% will not be in the top 130 years. So it's happening quickly, it's creating uncertainty, and it's going to create some collateral damage. In Race Against the Machine, another book I've been reading, the discussion centers around the pace of change in developed economies actually displacing more people than get new jobs out of the digital economy. So there are real consequences for this, and as I go through my talk, there will be endless discussions of people who need, examples of people who need retraining as a result of what's going on. Now, the interesting observation is that the current wave of innovation is in some measure, and no one can quantify how much, in some measure being fueled by wackynomics, the printing of money in vast quantities by central banks in Tokyo, in the US, and in Europe. There is a direct correlation between technology seed funding and the NASDAQ Composite Index, and there is obviously a correlation, a negative correlation between what happens with the NASDAQ index and what happens with interest rates. So in simple terms, if I want to give $1 million to a bank in Switzerland today, I'm probably going to get $980,000 back. I'm not going to get $1 million and something. There are not only low interest rates, there are negative interest rates. And in that environment, people start chasing returns. There's a weight of money going into equities, going into alternative assets, and it is without question, as somebody who has lived through, I'm carbon dating myself here, someone who's lived through 87, through the Asia crisis, through the tech wreck, through the financial crisis, it is clear there is a weight of money going into innovation right now, much of which would not be funded in a normal economic setting. Now, I think it's a great thing. It's fantastic because people are trying new things, but we just need to be aware that circumstantially there are reasons why this is all happening now, and that's a small part of it. I think there are far greater reasons related to mobile, social, the cloud, analytics, Internet of Things, etc. But there we are. So, the Tsunami 1.0. In the late 90s, I left Hong Kong in 2000. When I left Hong Kong, Cyberport wasn't here. It was being talked about. I have to say, having toured it yesterday, it's amazing. We had email, we used the web, but it was all fairly primitive in those days. A lot of money was spent globally on startups that failed. One or two good companies were built out of it, but in simple terms, smartphones didn't exist, bandwidth wasn't there, skills weren't there for it to really take off. So it was a precursor, it was an appetizer to the real deal. And I think the real deal started from 2000 to 2010. So let's just do a very quick and somewhat superficial journey over that decade and look at what happened. In the US, travel agents halved in number over a decade. We went from 100,000 travel agents to 50,000 travel agents, all with the rise of Travelocity and Orbitz and Expedia and Priceline and so on. At the same time, CD shipments, we all know that story. CD shipments peaked around 2000 and they've just kept falling. Soon I think there may be more vinyl produced than CDs. We know the story about music. It's very interesting to see iTunes buying Beats to get a streaming strategy because even the early disruptors are now being disrupted. Books, we know the story about books. Cameras, global camera sales fell 30% last year, I read. With the rise of the smartphone and great cameras in your smartphone, put your hand up if you've bought a camera in the last year. Rob, you should be embarrassed.
Underwater.
Okay. But, I think that says a lot, the rise of the smartphone, the decline of the camera. Advertisements, this is something that we've been studying quite closely. The demise of newspaper advertising, or in fact above-the-line advertising, and the rise of Google and online media are really something to behold. Down under, there's a company called Fairfax Media, which today has a market capitalization of $2.45 billion US dollars. Fairfax once owned what the Aussies called the Rivers of Gold, and the Rivers of Gold were classified advertisements for cars, employment, real estate, dating, stuff for sale. Along came Seek, car sales, real estate, Trade Me, etc., that disintermediated, disrupted, took all that business away. Those businesses today have a market capitalization of $16.5 billion. Poor old Fairfax, 2.45. That's big disruption. This is really interesting. I'll dwell on it for a couple of minutes. What we have here is the share of market that online media has around the world as a percentage of total media. So if you think about total media spend being billboards, radio, free-to-air TV, print ads, bus stops, all that sort of stuff, the percentage that digital media comprises, back in 2000 when I left Hong Kong, it was 0 to 1% here. And it was 2 to 4% in most big economies around the world. Now the UK has hit about 50%. The US is it's approaching 30%. Australia is a little more, a little higher. But you can see what I call a disruption zone here. Because you can see that with Hong Kong at 13%, Singapore at 12%, Southeast Asia at 7%, there is a lot of disruption going to happen to traditional media. I went to my fund manager the other day to kind of agree our investment parameters for the next year. And she said, I want to buy you Singapore Press Holdings. And I said, do not buy Singapore Press Holdings. I do not want to buy anything that owns a newspaper. Whether I'm right or wrong, the point is at some point, these markets are going to go to here, and it's going to come out of someone else's pocket, and it's going to hurt, and it's going to happen. The numbers are even more stark if you look at it on a per capita basis. On a per capita basis, developed economies, the online media spend for per capita is in the $75 to $150 US per year range. So let's just replay that. $75 to $150 US a year is spent in digital media terms per capita. Anyone have a guess at what it might be in Southeast Asia? $3. $3. It shows you the extent of the opportunity. And I'm going to have a plug for my business here. That is why we're building a Southeast Asian online digital services business, because we think it's going to be quite big. Telcos, you may have seen, this has been circulating recently, this slide. This is really interesting. This just shows how SMS has been passed by other forms of messaging. So WhatsApp alone is doing about 30 billion messages a day. Global SMS, 20 billion. So it's 50% bigger already. That omits WeChat, Line, etc. So, SMS started in about 2000. It's peaked and it's on the way down. I wouldn't want to be a telco at the moment either. Which takes us to Tsunami 2.0, which is the really interesting stuff. This planet is getting very connected. Now, I've gone out and colleagues and I have done some research and we've looked at forecasts from a range of places and we've tried to work out what's a consensus forecast. What are the highs, the lows, the middles? So we've come up with some numbers that frankly may or may not be right, but the story is really important. There are going to be 4 billion smartphones by 2020, and whether it's 3.5 or 5, it's a big number. 1 billion homes connected with Wi-Fi. Cisco believe there are going to be 50 billion connected devices out there, which we'll talk about in a minute, and about 100 million connected cars. Some huge markets are emerging, and there's going to be some big disruption as this happens. You know, we're talking about, whether you call it an Internet of Things or an Internet of Everything, being a market of, say, $600 billion by 2020. We're talking about a sharing economy, $300 billion by 2020. We're talking the cloud, services, hardware, software, the whole thing, $200 billion, $100 billion for big data. Even if these numbers are 50% wrong, even if they only come out to be half that size, that's the total current revenues today of Google, Microsoft, Apple, Samsung Electronics, and IBM by 2020. It's probably a bit of double counting because some of their revenues will be in there, but you get the picture. There is some very profound stuff going on in the background now. And in my mission to talk to boards, chairmen, CEOs about this stuff, I'm really surprised at the lack of depth of perception of the challenge. There's a perception that something's going on, but frankly, a lot of people think, well, 1.0 is over, you know, I didn't get disrupted like music, I'm not a newspaper, I'm not free-to-air TV, I'm probably okay. Think again. I made sure there's a Xiaomi phone up here, especially for KK. Actually, I've got to have a plug for Xiaomi now as well. What I'm wearing on my wrist is a great little example of a disruption. My son, who lives in Kuala Lumpur, sent it to me for my birthday. He said, Dad, your Fitbit keeps breaking. Your Fitbit you have trouble using. Your jawbone up band breaks, because you've been through 2 of them. Everyone in my office is wearing one of these, a Mi Band. It's $20, so it's 20% of the price. It's really cool. You don't need to charge it very often. And it's very disruptive. So there's my little plug for my new friend KK. But seriously, great example of disruption. Back to the phone. We all know about Steve Jobs saying this will change everything back in 2007. It's very old news, but it's the foundation piece, I think, for most of what's happening at the moment. And how these little puppies have taken over. Our kids spend 2 to 4 hours a day on them. We're wedded to them. Our noses are in them all the time. They're ubiquitous, they're cheap. They've got more processing power than NASA had when it put man on the moon in '69. So they're here and they're not going anywhere and they're just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And the things that we can do with them are just phenomenal. Some of you may have seen this before. I don't claim to have created it, but I found it somewhere and couldn't find the source. I'm going to talk about the sharing economy, the Internet of Things, a little bit about 3D printing. Hal's going to tell me if I go on too long. Where are you, Hal? You tell me, okay? The sharing economy. We all know it today as Uber and as Airbnb. To somebody who's always bought a drill, because I had to do one hole every 5 years, it's quite a revolutionary and cool concept to just use someone else's asset. I've lived in Singapore for 4 years. I've never owned a car. I just catch a Grab taxi or an Uber every day. The concept of properly utilizing assets that have already been bought, that are underutilized, rather than wrecking the planet further by buying something for yourself and not using it, I think it's very cool. I'm no environmentalist, but I can see the logic. Experts say this is growing to a $300 billion economy. I don't know whether it's going to 50 or 500, but clearly it has legs. And if you talk to someone from Uber or Airbnb, it has real legs. Governments don't necessarily know how to deal with it. It's tricky. It's very tricky. You see governments around the world, from New York to Germany to even in Australia, you know, there are cab drivers doing citizens' arrests on Uber drivers. It is really getting out of hand. But my point is, don't underestimate the sharing economy, because people are going to find things to share and ways to share them that none of us have thought of. It's just the beginning. The Internet of Everything. John Chambers, CEO of Cisco, says the impact of the Internet of Things is going to be far, far more profound than anything that we've seen since we've been connected. So that's quite a profound statement, and taken to its conclusion, what it means is there are going to be sensors connecting tens of billions of objects, data flowing freely between them, a very transparent world in which everything becomes just hugely more efficient. You'll know when things are out of stock, you'll know when machines need to be fixed, you'll know transport usage, patterns are going to change. And this is all happening under our noses today. Connected devices are very soon, there will be more connected devices very soon than there are laptops, mobiles, tablets, desktop computers. It is truly happening under our noses. I'm skating through this in the interest of time, but let's pause for a moment on 3D printing, which is very interesting. I've just come from Founders Forum in Singapore, which is a technology event, and I met a young man there who, it sounds so old, doesn't it? I met a young guy there who has invented a 3D printer. He's taking it to market for 1,288 Singapore dollars, so it's like 1,000 US. And I said, surely the market isn't ready yet. Who are you selling to? And he said, I'm shipping them to Africa like you would not believe. And I said, why Africa? And he said, well, there are remote communities who have no money, they can't afford to freight things in, and they're making things on the spot. They're making basic things on the spot to serve the daily needs of their community. Personally, I don't think 3D printers are there yet, but I think when they come, when we have a Steve Jobs moment, or I'll talk about the Xerox 914 shortly, when we have that moment where they become ubiquitous, cheap, efficient, and they deliver for us, we are going to be making stuff in our bedrooms, in our offices, at the corner 7-Eleven. And the more we make, the more it's going to disrupt the manufacturers, the warehouses, the people who drive trucks between the warehouses and the shops. Patterns of distribution will change. Raw materials will suddenly be delivered to metro areas, to CBD, instead of to factories. It's coming. The Xerox 914. In 1959, Xerox released the 914, which was the smartphone moment, if you like. They spent 20 to 30 years trying to build a photocopier that would make it easy to photocopy. In reality, that was a really big machine. Some people had to lift it in a crane and take windows out to get it into their offices, but it was quite revolutionary. The Smithsonian magazine recently wrote an article about it, and in the magazine they said, when it came out in 59, maybe 60, photocopying went up from 20 million copies a year to 14 billion within just a few years. And I think that's the sort of thing that is going to happen when 3D printing works, when Apple or HP or somebody releases a 3D printer that actually works. How long it's going to take, none of us know. So the message is that everything ahead is being disrupted, or you could say, putting a more positive spin on it, is being innovated. This is quite a hard page to read, so I would hope that we may make the pack available afterwards and people can have a look. This actually came from some LinkedIn research, and it shows you the large dots are the industries that will be hiring people. The red ones are okay, and the black ones are going to be shrinking and losing quite a lot of people. There is going to be a lot of retraining. I mean, there are going to be steam locomotive people who don't have jobs anymore. There are going to be blacksmiths who don't have jobs anymore. There are going to be people who need to retrain. We're going to have a society run by today's young people. Baby boomers are going to be out of it, and we've got a whole legion of people who will need to be retrained when everything happens. Michael Porter says, the most important question you need to ask is, what business am I in? Because the lines between products and services are blurring. If I catch an Uber or a Grab taxi or one of those services, the lines are being blurred between a taxi and a private car. With Airbnb, am I a landlord or am I a tenant? All the lines are being blurred. And the challenge that large companies have in trying to reinvent themselves or deal with all this innovation and disruption is they tend to look at their business as they run it today, rather than from the perspective of two people in a garage somewhere who don't look at it that way at all. The two people in a garage are probably going to invent something they weren't intending to that's going to disrupt a major company that's looking at it like this. And this is the real issue in my view. If you're in a large company, change must be sponsored from the top. It's got to be sponsored by the CEO, it's got to be sponsored by the board. If the CEO starts a change program, he has to drag his management team along with him, but he's got 5 minutes, thank you very much. He has to drag his board along with him. And if you've ever been a CEO or if you are a CEO, you know that if you're embarking on a major transformation program, if you're going to spend a whole lot of money doing things differently, your directors have to back you. Which is why we need to ask the question, is your board ready for this fight? We've done a bit of original research on this subject. We've looked at the top 20 companies listed on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. We've looked at the top 20 companies on the Singapore Stock Exchange, the Australian Stock Exchange, the New Zealand Stock Exchange, which just happen to be the countries in which we're having these discussions currently. There are approximately 800 directors of those companies. We have poured through their CVs. We've looked carefully at the backgrounds of the different directors to find out, do they have any technology expertise to speak of, any track record? Doesn't mean they're a digital native or they're able to deal with disruption. It's just a simple question, have they got a technology degree? Have they ever been responsible for technology? Are they likely to get it? And the answer is that of the top companies in those countries, fewer than 10% of directors have any technology qualification. But it gets worse. If you take out telcos, because telcos are lining their boards with techies because you have to if you're a telco. And if you take out tech companies, for obvious reasons, you get a universe of companies that is marginally smaller, but in which fewer than 5% of directors have any technology background. And those 5% are not digital natives. They've never been through a digital transformation. They just know how to use a keyboard in some cases, and in other cases, obviously somewhat more. We went through them and asked ourselves the philosophical question, how many of those people would we hire to help clients, to join our company and help clients with digital transformation? It was a very, very short list. So I feel that is one of the major challenges facing the corporate world at the moment, is actually changing board structures so that the governance of a company can be focused on change and supporting management as you go through that journey. So in summary, the digital tsunami is happening now, and it's happening fast. It's happening on multiple fronts. It's not just mobile or social or cloud or analytics or Internet of Everything or sharing economy. It's all at once. It is way more urgent than people think. Even disruptors are now being disrupted. Leadership is a deciding factor, all of which leads me to the important question, that is, are you a disruptor or are you going to be disrupted? Thanks very much.
Thank you, Roger. Thank you. That was great. Thanks. Okay, who wants to answer that question first? Thank you, Roger. That was really an inspirational kickoff. Thank you very, very much.